Hi, I'm Tori St. Cyr, otherwise known as the Adventist Watchman. This video right here is going to kick off a long video series on the investigative judgment, the sanctuary, and the scapegoat. This is just an introduction, but we're going to introduce the sanctuary through Daniel chapter 8. Are you ready? Let's go. As Seventh-day Adventists, we teach something that's called the investigative judgment, okay? And if you know anything about the Adventist church, you should understand that the doctrine of the investigative judgment, or the sanctuary message, or the 2300-day prophecy, our interpretation of that 2300-day prophecy is a pillar of the Seventh-day Adventist church. In other words, without the investigative judgment, you don't really have a Seventh-day Adventist church. Is one of the foundational teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist church. So it behooves us as Adventists to make sure that we fully understand this. Now, if you've been an Adventist for any length of time, you should also understand that this teaching is being ridiculed by many evangelicals, Catholics, and ex-Adventists. Okay? And I can partially understand why it's being ridiculed, because I believe that many times we don't really teach this properly, okay? And so what I want to do is I want to make sure that I provide all the information that you need to know in order to make an educated decision on whether the sanctuary message as we teach it is a biblical doctrine, okay? And we understand that this sanctuary message is actually, in fact, one of the biggest reasons why Seventh-day Adventists leave the church. Now, there's other reasons. There's plenty of other reasons, but up there at the top, or at least one of the places at the top, is held by the sanctuary message, or the investigative judgment, as the Adventist church teaches it. All right. Now, in order to do this justice, in order to teach this with any amount of clarity for you, I want to make sure that we go slow and steady. I want to make sure that that we take our time, and that we present this message in a clear and coherent manner just for you. All right. So the way that I want to introduce the sanctuary message to you is I want to introduce it to you through Daniel chapter 8. Okay. This is video 1, and this is going to be a long series. Okay. So I'm going to warn you, but what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to answer every single question that you can even think of for the sanctuary, the investigative judgment, and the scapegoat. Every question that you can think of, I'm going to attempt to do that, okay? There will be no question that I'm going to run from. There'll be no subjects on the sanctuary that I'm going to hide from, okay? I'm going to try to answer every question, and I'm going to try to answer it as fair as possible, okay? So with that being said, what I want to do is, before we go directly into the sanctuary, let's talk about the structure of Daniel chapter 8, okay? Now, the structure of Daniel chapter 8, the way I've structured it, is into 7 different sections or divisions, okay? So the first section is the vision. Daniel sees a vision of a ram and a goat, okay? And that's verses 1 through 8. All right, the next section sees the vision of the little horn. I've separated the vision from the little horn. Even though it's part of the same vision, I've separated it here because it spawns off a whole nother study, okay? So, but section 2 is the vision of the little horn. That's verses 9 through 12. The third section is the vision of the 2300 evening mornings. That's verses 13 through 14. Verses 15 through 19 is additional details on that 2300 evening and morning vision. The fifth part is the interpretation of the vision of the ram and the goat. The sixth part, and that's verses 20 through 22. And then the sixth part is additional details on the little horn, verses 23 to 25. And then it ends up, for the last 2 verses, with commentary on the vision of the 2300 evening and mornings. Okay. Now, in order to see the sanctuary through Daniel chapter 8, we got to make sure that we fully understand the first section or the first division, which is the vision of the ram and the goat. Okay. Now, verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first." Verse 2, "And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai." Verse 3, "Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last." So we begin by seeing that Daniel in vision sees 2 animals. He sees a ram and then he sees a goat. So far, so good, right? Now, we don't need to guess who the ram and the goat are because the chapter interprets itself. All right. So we can see in verse number 20, it identifies the ram with 2 horns when it says, "The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Now, if we understand this prophecy here, we should understand that it doesn't just represent one king of Media and one king of Persia. It represents that the horns represents all the kings of Media, and the other horn represents all the kings of Persia. All right. Now, verse 21 identifies the goat with 1 horn when it says, "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king." Okay. Now, we should understand that Greece only had 1 king, and that was Alexander the Great. So far, so good. Now, in verses 4 through 7, we see the fall of the Persian Empire to the rising Grecian Empire, or Alexander the Great. Verse 8 says, "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven." Now, we understand that around 323 BC, Alexander the Great died suddenly, okay? So he had conquered like most of the known world, and then all of a sudden he dies, all right? Now, because Alexander the Great didn't really have a succession plan in place, the kingdom then became divided between all his generals and officials, okay? So they warred and they consolidated and they fought with each other, and eventually it was divided into about 4 different kingdoms, okay? 1 to the north, 1 to the south, 1 to the east, and then 1 to the west, all right? And those were the 4 divisions of Alexander's kingdom after he had died. So now the kingdom was divided into 4 sections, and we understand that those 4 sections are identified in Daniel chapter 8 by the 4 horns that came from the great horn on the goat. Okay, does that make sense? So you have the goat, Alexander the great horn was him. He dies. His kingdom is broken up. The horn is broken up. And out of that 1 horn, you have 4 horns that arise. And those 4 horns represents the 4 divisions of Alexander the Great's kingdom. Now, the next verse introduces a component of this prophecy that is called the little horn. Okay. Now, typically, most Adventists identify the little horn as the Roman Empire. Okay. Now, some make this strictly the papal Roman Empire. Some make it the papal and pagan Roman Empire. But for the most part, most Adventists see this as some part of the Roman Empire, okay? And I'm no different than that. I see this as a component of initially pagan Rome, and then it transitions to papal Rome. So this little horn is both phases of the Roman Empire. Now, you must understand that this little horn is heavily disputed by evangelicals and Catholics alike, okay? Now, most evangelicals and Catholics believe that this little horn represented a general, right? Yeah, or a king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. All right. Now, there is some reason it's not illogical for them to believe that, but when we look closely at it, we can see that that it can't be Antiochus Epiphanes. But I'm going to get into that on a whole nother study. I'm going to dedicate a whole study just to Antiochus Epiphanes so that we can understand why they believe Antiochus is the little horn and why it can't be. He can't be the little horn. So, but for the sake of this study, let's just assume that the little horn represents both phases of the Roman Empire. Now, let's tally up what we have thus far. In the vision, we have beginning with the Medo-Persian Empire, conquered by the Greek Empire, then taken over or transitioned to the divided Greek Empire, then conquered by the Roman Empire. Okay? That's what Daniel 8, the vision of Daniel 8, is really talking about here. Now, what you may not understand is that these kingdoms are Satan's attempt to mimic God's sanctuary. All right? Now, you may not see it, but you're going to see it in just a minute here. Now, let's briefly look at the sanctuary. The sanctuary represented God's plan to redeem mankind back into favor with him, okay? The sanctuary is through the sanctuary is God's plan of salvation, okay? Now, let's look at a couple of facts around this powerful structure that we call the sanctuary, around this structure, this instrument that God used to facilitate salvation to his people. All right. The earthly sanctuary, we start with an outer court. Okay. So this is not inside the sanctuary, but this is the outside portion of the sanctuary. Now, in this outer court, you had a laver, and then you had a bronze altar, which was mainly for the sacrifices that happened in the sanctuary. All right. Now, if you were to go west of the laver, because remember, the sanctuary goes from east to west. Okay. So now if you were to go west of the altar of burnt offerings, then you come into the holy place. The sanctuary had two components, or two compartments, excuse me. One was the holy place. The other one was the most holy place. The holy place was the first compartment that you arrived in, but west of the holy place was the most holy place, and this is where the presence of God was. But let's talk a little bit about the holy place. The holy place had three main pieces of furniture in it. You had the table of showbread that was on the north side. You had the candlestick, which was on the south side. And in the middle of that, you had the altar of incense. Okay. Now, west of that, you have a curtain. And then inside that curtain, you have the Ark of the Covenant. And above the Ark of the Covenant was two angels. And then inside the Ark of the Covenant was the Ten Commandments. And obviously, west of the Ark was the presence of God, or what they call the Shekinah glory. All right. So that, in a nutshell, is what the sanctuary looked like, or a description of the components of the sanctuary. Hopefully you're following me thus far. Now, I told you that Daniel 8 reveals that Satan is trying to mimic the sanctuary. And what do I mean by that? You must understand that the ram and the goat were both animals that were used in the sanctuary service. The ram was used as a burnt offering as part of the daily ministration, and the goat was used as a sin offering as part of the yearly ministration, also known as the Day of Atonement. So we can see that the two animals that were chosen in Daniel chapter 8 are sanctuary animals. Now, obviously, Satan did not give the name to these animals. These names were designated by the prophecy or God himself. But we understand the concept is delved into the sanctuary, and you're going to see even further. For you must understand that when you enter the sanctuary, you start on the east, okay? And where does the kingdoms that Satan used to attack God's people, where did they begin in Daniel chapter 8? They started east, okay? So you have Persia, which was east. You have Media, which is west of Persia. Then who attacked Persia, or who destroyed Persia and or Media Persia? You had the Greek Empire, which was west of Medo Persia. And then, ladies and gentlemen, notice that when Alexander the Great fell, his kingdom divided into 4 kingdoms. And in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 8, it describes those kingdoms as 4 horns. Well, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that the altar of burnt offerings had 4 horns on it? Did you know that the altar of incense had 4 horns on it? Now, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that after the division of 4 empires, it broke up into 2 empires, a king of the north and a king of the south? Isn't it interesting that there's an angel that stood on the north and there was an angel that stood on the south? And then the Roman Empire was fully west of them all. The Roman Empire was called the Little Horn. Well, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that God, or Jesus Christ, was called the Horn? Notice what Luke chapter 1 verse 69 says. It says, and hath raised up an horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, talking about the power of Christ. Ladies and gentlemen, we can see when we look at the concepts of Daniel chapter 8, we should be able to see that Satan believes that he has a sanctuary, and his sanctuary is more powerful than God's sanctuary. You should be able to see that in Daniel chapter 8, there is a sanctuary hidden within this chapter, and it reveals that Satan himself believes that he is the God of this world, and he has his own sanctuary. But we're going to expose him in this series. This is simply an introduction to the sanctuary through Daniel chapter 8. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Adventist Watchman, and now you understand the sanctuary through Daniel chapter 8.